Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to the session of Quran for Ramadan. Today we are going to study of some verses from Surah Dhariyat, which is the 51st Surah of the Quran. You will have noticed that whenever you read the Quran, and especially the discussion comes up regarding the punishment of the people who are going to be put to task there or taken to task there, often this happens that opposite to that or right after that, the fate of the believers is also mentioned. This is a very common pattern of the Quran, to discuss two diverse things, to discuss two opposite things. So when people who are to be punished in the next world, they are mentioned and the details of their punishment are mentioned. Of course, the sins and the crimes they did, the offenses they committed, which have made them eligible to go to hell. In a similar way, it is often mentioned that people who will end up in paradise, what exactly would be their traits, what would lead them to paradise, what deeds did they do which made them the companions of paradise. And precisely the passage that we are going to study today has this detail in it. It tells us that people who have certain traits will end up in the paradise of the Almighty. One thing that you might also need to know is that the description which is mentioned of paradise in the Quran has a lot to do with the Arab taste. So remember, the Quran is foremost addressing the Arabs of its own times, and the things that they liked as reward, they are mentioned as constituents and components of paradise. And they would like paradise, of course, areas of paradise or areas in their own world that would be situated on high mountain tops, gardens, and orchards, because in those times, things that would really be against the blooming and the blossoming of gardens would be storms and tempests which would come and destroy them. So they would make these orchards and gardens on high plains, on mountains, on hillocks, so that the water could not destroy them and flood them as well. So you would often hear of this description as Jannatin Tajri min tahtiha al-anhar, which means that it will have orchards below which streams flow. So people who are not aware of this detail often think that when we come across this description that there are orchards below which streams are going to flow, they think that perhaps paradise will have underground canals or underground water canals. Notwithstanding the fact, yes, that can also be a possibility. But when the Quran says that there will be canals, there will be orchards below which canals will be flowing, it's not referring to these underground canals. It is rather referring to the fact that these orchards, because they would be situated at a high place, at a very high altitude, so the fountains and the canals and the rivers would be passing in the valleys around that hill. So this is what is implied. And more than that, other details of this description also suit this Arab taste. But in order to know this fact that yes, the Quran is also a book which relates to the rest of mankind. So to make that point as well, at many instances, the Quran says that these are the reward that you will get, and referring specifically to the rewards which the Arabs would like. And because the Quran was meant for all times to come, so one sentence is generally added at the description of the paradise ends, and that is lahum fiha ma tashtahi anfusukum, that you will get whatever you desire, whatever your heart's desire is, you'll get that. Which means, of course, that whatever these details are, they are for people who like such rewards or such places. But other than that, there would be anything that would come to your mind, anything that you would desire in your heart. And this is something which is perhaps unimaginable for us here, because imagine that whatever comes to our mind and it is made available in the wink of an eye. That is something which we cannot even dream of. But such will be the pleasures of paradise, such will be the bliss that will be facing in the life of paradise, that whatever we think of, whatever we imagine, we will have that thing. So let's start off with this passage. It says, إِنَّ الْمُتَّقِينَ فِي جَنَّاتٍ وَعُيُونٍ آخِذِينَ مَا آتَاهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ مُحْسِنِينَ كَانُوا قَلِيلًا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ مَا يَهْجَعُونَ وَبِالْأَسْحَارِ هُمْ يَسْتَغْفِرُونَ وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. However, the righteous on that day will be among orchards and springs, receiving what has been bestowed on them by their Lord. Before this, they were thorough in their deeds. They would sleep very little at night, and in its final hours would seek forgiveness from their Lord, and in their wealth was a share for those who ask and for the deprived. So, as this passage begins, the very first words which you can see are set out here are that the righteous on that day will be among orchards and springs. So, as I said, that this description is something which is made, or it is described the way it is, generally to keep in mind the fact that this is what the Arabs really loved. They would like these fountains, they would like these orchards and springs and gardens and all things which relate to natural beauty. Of course, everyone has a flair for these things. We do cherish such things, but as I said, there are things that might not find a mention in the Quran, and the reason being that the first addressees of the Quran, they are always given that consideration. So the righteous, the people who had remained muttaqi. So taqwa is a very special term of the Quran. It means that the people who kept themselves within the bounds which were prescribed for them by the Almighty. They did not cross those bounds. So a person who is muttaqi, a person who has taqwa, is actually a person who abides by the limits, by the conditions, by the bounds which God has prescribed for him in his religion. And this is actually the reward that we get for abiding by these restrictions, by abiding by these requisites. Because in order to abide by these requisites, we have to restrain ourselves, we have to control ourselves. And viewers, we are passing through this month of Ramadan. We are now at the middle of this month. Half the month has already gone. Whatever half remains, this is a very, very good opportunity for us to still reap its blessings and once again refresh in our minds that if you have to reach the life of paradise, if you have to earn the pleasure of God, then to be a muttaqi, to be a person who remains within the bounds of God, is something that should be a target for all of us. So this month, of course, is a month in which we are all abiding by the limits of the Almighty in a very special way. And that is that even things which are absolutely lawful for us, absolutely lawful for us. I mean, having thirst and having hunger and having a craving for a sexual desire that can be satisfied from the wife, in spite of that, we restrain ourselves for 16 hours, 17 hours or so, and we actually we become an embodiment of obedience to the Almighty, because it is He who has said that if you disentangle yourself from these desires for some time, then it will produce that self-control in you. It will produce that restraint in you, which will be, of course, the outcome of this restraint, the outcome of this patience and perseverance is taqwa, which means that you will now be more dutiful, more mindful of the limits of God. So these limits and these bounds, if they are to be abided by, then there's nothing better a training workshop than the Quran itself. The Quran is than Ramadan himself. I beg your pardon. So Ramadan is a month in which that self-restraint and that control and discipline is something that we learn, and we need to continue with this learning. We need to actually implement this learning for the rest of the 11 months. And then it says, آخذين ما آتاهم ربهم إنهم كانوا قبل ذلك محسنين. Receiving what has been bestowed on them by their Lord. So this sentence is actually related to the life hereafter, to the life in paradise. It is said that these people will be receiving whatever their Lord would be giving them, whatever presents and gifts and favors He would bestow on them, they will receive them in paradise. And we know from various parts of the Quran, various instances in the Quran, that each time that we were given something that we think was the same as we had been given before, we would think that it is the same thing. But each time, as the Quran says, وَأُتُوا بِهِ مُتَشَابِهًا, they would be given something similar, whereas it will not be the same. A banana, for example, would be a banana for us with a special taste when we taste it for the first time in paradise. But once it comes to us again, once we eat it a second time, it will still be a banana, but have a new taste, a unique taste that will savor our taste buds. So such is the nature of these gifts and favors, that they will have so much variety, would have so much difference in the positive sense, that we will relish every bit of it. And now the reason here is also cited, and the verses subsequent to this verse also, they continue to cite this reason, or these reasons to be more precise. So the first thing that is said is, إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ مُحْسِنِينَ, that these were the people who were very thorough in their lives. In this life, which means, of course, the life of this world, they were individuals who would be extremely thorough. They would be very meticulous. They would try to do every good deed, not just to not just by going through its motions, but in the most optimum way, in the most befitting way. If they would spend in the most befitting way. If they would be kind and affectionate and considerate to other people, it would be as if they would be an embodiment of these virtues and attributes. So every single thing that they would do, whether related to the Almighty or to their own brethren, it would be in a very matchless way, in an impeccable way. And that is what the Quran wants us to do. Innahum kanu qabla zalika muhsinin. So the word muhsin, of course, is made from ihsan, which means to do something in a very, very thorough way, in a very way in which we'd like to do something in a perfect way. So to be a perfectionist, rather, is what is meant here. That whatever we do for the cause of religion, whatever righteous thing we do, it should be that we, in our own right, just as we tend to do things in our professional life in a very perfect way, and we are perfectionists. So the Almighty wants us to be perfectionists also in all good deeds, and we have to discharge them. We have to carry out these obligations in a way that everything is done not only in letter but also in spirit. So when you follow something in letter and spirit, that is what the word Mohsin actually comes for. The next thing which is mentioned here is Kanu qalilan min al-layli ma yahja'un wa bil ashari hum yastaghfirun. So these two things are two facets of the same thing, or the same phenomena, and that is that they would sleep very little at night. Kanu qalilan min al-layli ma yahja'un wa bil ashari hum yastaghfirun. And the consequence of this would be that in the final hours, or in early morning, the final hours of night, they would seek forgiveness of the Almighty. It is here that we need to refresh ourselves that this verse and these verses, in fact, are referring to the night prayer, to the tahajjud prayer. We know that the Prophet, it was mandatory for him to pray 6 prayers, and the 6th prayer that is basically optional for all of his followers and all the ummah, that is the tahajjud prayer. But for him, it was an obligation, and he would wake up and stand for a better part of the night. And we know from Surah Muzammil the details of how he would be diligently worshipping the Almighty and reading the Quran, and also at the same time, the Quran has said that reading the Quran at this time is something which becomes very, very effective for the mind's resolve and for our own concentration. And we also know from Surah Muzammil that the Prophet and many the Prophet's practice would be followed by many of his companions who would also carry out this obligation. So this is something, again, being in the month of Ramadan, it is now something that we can do almost every day when we wake up for our suhoor. So just before that, if we are able to offer the tahajjud prayer, which is of course a prayer in which we just offer the rakats of the prayer in odd numbers, and if you're able to do so, this is how we would be able to discharge this responsibility, or to be more precise, this optional prayer. And the Quran has made it clear, and also the narratives of the Prophet, that the most blessed time of a day, of a 24-hour day, is this tahajjud time after. And this is the prayer which is the most blessed after all. It stands at the top of all optional prayers, because it is here that you need to really break your sleep and get up at night. So the word tahajjud actually literally means to break your sleep and get up. So when you break your sleep and get up at night, which is like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or whatever the time which is prescribed in that part of the year, it's not easy. It's really difficult to get control and get out of the bed, do wuzu, and stand up in the prayer. But in the month of Ramadan, it becomes much easier. So not only this, the Quran says that these are people who bil asharihum yastaghfirun, that who in the morning hours they seek God's forgiveness, which means that they are always mindful of the fact that they have done certain blemishes have been committed by them, certain mistakes and offenses, and there are things that keep happening, and they keep asking for forgiveness. And this is the time when the Almighty is also in the mood to forgive them the most, especially the minor sins. And then it is said, وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ, that in their wealth was a share for those who ask and for the deprived, which means that these were the people who in their own lifetime, of course, now since the verses are speaking of paradise in particular, So it is said that when they were living in this world, they had a share for people, and what people who would be asking them for help, and mahroom, who would be deprived, who have some, who would not be able to earn for themselves or were not in a position to earn their livelihood. So they would have a certain share, which shows that basically it is zakat which is being talked about here, because we know that zakat, or this obligation of charity or obligatory charity, is something that has existed since earliest times. So all these worship rituals, we have been discussing them, this fact and this facet earlier on as well, that these never began with Prophet Muhammad, as is generally erroneously understood. In fact, they began very earlier on, from very early prophets. And zakat itself, the prayer, and we know Hajj was done in the times of Prophet Abraham, when he built the house of God with his son Ishmael. And even before that, we know these rituals had been carried out by the believers of their own respective prophets. So yes, this is something, that is precisely why we find the details of our worship rituals not being mentioned in the Quran, because they were handed down to us in the form of perpetual practice and an established sunnah of the previous prophets of God, and more specifically as an Abrahamic sunnah, because it was in the times of Abraham that they became more crystallized, and from him they passed down to us right to the Prophet Muhammad, who lived about 2,500 years after Abraham. So they passed down to him the prayer ritual, the zakat, everything. And we find that these people about whom it is being talked about here, that they had a share for all people who were deprived, for all people who would ask for this help, and they would not withhold it. So with this, we come to an end to our discussion of this passage, and now we can move to the Q&A section.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for an enlightening session. There's a question in the chat. If someone has sinned and asked for forgiveness, would their sins be exposed in the day of judgment, and will they be humiliated in front of the other people, as per some tradition and religion people usually talk about?
Well, could you please slightly repeat I couldn't hear the last part. The person has sinned, and what exactly is the question?
If a person has sinned and asked for forgiveness, would their sins be
Right.
exposed on the day of judgment and will be humiliated in front of other people?
So you see, sins which are already forgiven, they will not be displayed in his account of deeds, because they are the ones that have been already deleted. Only sins which remain, of course, would be known to that person. And at times, the nature of these sins is that they would come before him, and if the sin is of a publicly humiliating nature, then yes, for example, we know that the crime of adultery is something in which in this world he was punished, and the Quran says that adultery and fornication is something that should be publicly punished, and there should be people who should witness this punishment. So this humiliation, which already was there in the previous life, would continue, because this would be something that they would be exposed to in the later life as well. But there are so many other things about which we know from the Quran that their punishment, once it is given, of course, it becomes public knowledge that once a person becomes a convict, and if that convict continues with his ill ways, and he does not repent even after that punishment, then we can expect the same humiliation for such a person in the hereafter.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Now, Shaba Wasim, you may ask your question.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम सर। सर मेरा क्वेश्चन, सूरत शुरा में मैं एक आयत पढ़ी थी जिसमें था कि अगर आप पे जो भी मुसीबत आती है वो आपके अपने अमाल का नतीजा होता है, तो इसकी थोड़ी सी डिटेल आप बता देंगे ये इस आयत का?
I've answered this question a couple of sessions ago. Someone asked this question, and I explained that if you look at the context of this verse, you'll find out that it is not a generalized verse meant for every person. It is referring to the Quraysh, people who were the direct addressees of Prophet Muhammad, and about them it was certain that whatever they would do in this world, in spite of the fact that they knew who the Prophet was and they fully recognized him, so if they still committed any evil, then they would be punished in this world for their own misdeeds. So this verse is referring to Prophet's own specific addressees. This is not a general rule. Yes, and as a general rule, people can be punished for what they do as a misdeed, but for the Quraysh, it was a rule in which they had to be punished. For the rest of mankind, it is, possible that they could be punished because of their misdeeds. It could be possible because of the fact that they are being tried and tested through these circumstances, not because it's a punishment, but because it's a trial and test. So we have to make this distinction.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Musa Haroon, you may ask your question now.
Professor, my question is that like rituals, the way of rituals of namaz are not mentioned in the Quran, but the Quran several times mentioned that Quran is complete. My question is, does Hadith add on to the Quran, and if so, how is Quran complete?
So we've just discussed this question as well, and in fact, I just referred a part of it in my talk as well. That you see, first of all, we need to make a distinction between Hadith and Sunnah. So Sunnah is the established practice of the prophets of God, and it preceded the Quran. For example, the prayer, the zakat, Hajj, Umrah, charity, animal sacrifice, all these worship rituals were done by all previous prophets, and they were handed down to Prophet Muhammad, who then passed on to this ummah as his own established practice that we call the Sunnah. So Sunnah is an independent source of religion with the Quran, and these are the two primary sources. Hadith is something which is narrated by a few individuals, in which there is a record of some of the explanations of the Prophet. So it should not be confused with the Sunnah at all. So Sunnah is something that was passed on by the Prophet as the established practice of all religions, all prophets of God, and it mostly contained the content mostly comprised of these worship rituals and then certain etiquette and certain other practices. And this was done in a way, it was transmitted in exactly the same way as the Quran was. So the Quran was primarily transmitted through oral perpetuation, and this Sunnah was transferred through practical perpetuation, which means that people adhered in very large numbers and then transferred it. So these are the two primary sources, and they are two independent sources. Hadith is not a source of neither a source of religion. It's just a record of the Prophet's knowledge that has come down to us. And the Prophet never himself ever asked people to convey this knowledge to him, to other people. It was the Sahaba who thought that when they asked questions from the Prophet, they could receive very valuable answers, so they should inform other people as well. So it was like a initiative that took place from the Sahaba themselves to transfer the knowledge of the Prophet to other people. But the nature of this transfer was that few people who would hear some question or some answer from the Prophet, they would talk about it to some other people, and then it would be like a chain from one to the other. Not that a whole generation would be transmitting, as is the case with the Quran and the Sunnah, because in both these sources, everything would be transmitted by a whole generation to the next generation. But in the case of Hadith, a few people would be hearing something from the Prophet and then transferring to a few people, and so on and so forth, until it reached the compilers of Hadith. And precisely that is why it is called Khabar Wahid or Akhbar Ahad, because a few people are narrating it. So if this distinction is clear, I think your answer should, your question should stand answered.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Ahmed, you may ask your question now.
सर मेरा क्वेश्चन था कि मैंने क़यामत के हवाले से एक हदीस पढ़ी थी, जिसमें ये लिखा हुआ था कि क़यामत के दिन इंसानों के साथ-साथ जानवरों का भी हिसाब होगा। अगर किसी एक सींग वाली बकरी ने दूसरी जानवर को मारा होगा तो उसका भी बदला दिया जाएगा। तो मेरा सवाल इसी हदीस के हवाले से था कि जानवरों के लिए तो ये मजबूरी होती है कि वो दूसरे जानवर को मार के खाएँ, क्योंकि इस दुनिया में उन्हें सर्वाइव करना है। तो ये चीज़ तो अल्लाह पाक की सिफ़्ते अदल के खिलाफ नज़र आती है।
पहली बात तो ये कि रवायत है कहाँ, और ये सेहत के साथ साबित है, आपने चेक किया है? मेरे इल्म की हद तक ऐसी कोई सही रवायत साबित नहीं है।
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. There's a question in the chat. Is the Tahajjud prayer set exactly like the other prayers? The only difference is being that it is an odd number?
Yes, correct. That is exactly how it is offered.
Thank you. There's another question, which is that the practicing psychologists often use dream analysis techniques to help the client, and such techniques are primarily to understand the individual. Is this practice prohibited by Islam, since dream analysis is not considered ethical in Islam? What should be done in this case?
Why shouldn't it be considered ethical? I think it is, if you are able to delve into the subconscious. After all, hypnosis is something which delves into your subconscious self, and it extracts information, and it has worked wonders. I have seen a lot of patients who have very chronic depression. They get cured through hypnosis and through such dream analysis. So I think if it is something which is making a difference in their lives, it is a tool that science has provided us, and we should make good use of it. Only its ill use is something that of course should be refrained from. But and that is something which is not just confined to dream analysis or hypnosis. Using something for a bad purpose is something that relates to everything that comes that we come across.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Faiz, you may ask your question now.
मेरा सवाल ये है कि जो लोग प्रोफेशनल स्पोर्ट्समैन बनना चाहते हैं या स्पोर्ट्स एज अ करियर बना के करियर परस्यू करके अर्निंग करना चाहते हैं, तो उनके लिए क्या इस्लाम में क्या चाहिए?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sport is a very lawful profession. There's nothing wrong with it. If a person wants to become a professional sportsman, he could easily go through it. I mean, there's nothing which really stops him from. I mean, all the obligations that he has towards the Almighty and towards his fellow human beings, all that religion asks is that they should be carried out. And this is not just with sports; it is with any profession.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Is it compulsory to do? There's a question in the chat. Is it compulsory to do wudu before ghusl?
To wuzu before ghusl. You see, wuzu is part of ghusl. I mean, when you are doing ghusl, the ceremonial ghusl, I mean, you start off by doing wuzu. This is how the Prophet would do. So it's not, I would not say it's obligatory or just mandatory, but it is the practice of the Prophet. It is how he told us. It's like the proper mannerism that we should adopt.
Thank you. Sir Faraz Neemat, you may ask your question now.
डॉक्टर साहब, एक दो स्कूल ऑफ थॉट हैं. कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि हम किसी को जो है गैर मुस्लिम या काफिर नहीं करार दे सकते और ये स्टेट का काम नहीं है, और दूसरी तरफ एक स्कूल ऑफ थॉट ये जो कहता है कि नहीं, करार दिया जा सकता है. सूरह तौबा की जो आयत है 11 और 74, इसमें ये बताया गया है कि अगर वो तौबा कर लें और अपनी इस्लाह कर लें और नमाज कायम कर लें और ज़कात दें, तो इसमें ये आपके ख्याल से क्या बात सही है? आप किस चीज़ को ज़्यादा बेहतर समझते हैं?
मैं तो तफसील से जी इस पे लिख भी चुके हैं, हम बोल भी चुके हैं कि किसी को भी हक नहीं है किसी की तकफीर करने का. ये सिर्फ हक अल्लाह को है, ये पैगंबर को भी हक नहीं है. अल्लाह ताला ने पैगंबरों के ज़माने में जब लोगों की तकफीर का मतलब है कि जब उन्होंने जानते बूझते इनकार किया तो उनको काफिर करार दिया, तो पैगंबर को भी ये कहा कि मैं जब बताऊंगा, अल्लाह ताला कहते हैं, तब आपने ये तकफीर करनी है. तो ये हक तो खुदा ने किसी को दिया ही नहीं है. इसको उन्होंने एक्सरसाइज किया है, इसको उन्होंने इस्तेमाल किया है पैगंबरों के ज़माने में, क्योंकि वो पैगंबरों से कम्युनिकेट करते थे, उनको बताते थे कि अब जब आपने मेरे बिहाफ पे हक को वाज़ेह कर लिया है तो अब फलां फलां ग्रोह की आप तकफीर कर सकते हैं. इस वजह से ये तो हक सिरे से हासिल नहीं है. जहाँ तक सूरह तौबा की उन आयतों का ताल्लुक है, वो मुशरिकीन से मुतल्लिक है, दोनों की दोनों. फ़इन ताबू व अक़ामुस्सलात व आतुज़ ज़कात फ़इख़्वानुकुम फ़िद्दीन एक अल्फ़ाज़ है, और फ़इन ताबू व अक़ामुस्सलात व आतुज़ ज़कात फ़ख़ल्लू सबीलहुम, ये दूसरी आयत के अल्फाज हैं. और ये बताया जा रहा है कि ये जो मुशरिकीन हैं, अगर ये तौबा कर लेते हैं और नमाज कायम करते हैं और ज़कात देते हैं, तो फिर ये अब आपके बराबर के मुसलमान हैं. तो मुसलमानों को मुखातिब करके लिए कहा जा रहा है कि इनकी तौबा और इनकी जो इस्लाम लाना कबूल तब होगा कि जब ये काम करेंगे, और इसके बाद फिर ये उस अमन के या उस अमान के मुस्तहिक करार देंगे कि जो उनसे उठा ली गई थी. उनके बारे में कानून ये था कि वो ईमान लाएंगे, वरना उनको ख़त्म कर दिया जाएगा. इसलिए कि उन्होंने जानते बूझते शिर्क किया, और जब इसकी उनको इत्तला मिल भी गई, वो इस पर मुतमईन भी हो गए हम गलत कर रहे हैं, फिर भी उन्होंने तकब्बुर से इस पर इसरार किया. इसलिए उन दोनों आयतों का तो कोई अमूमी इतलाक है नहीं.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. There's a question in the chat. There's a hadith that mentioned Allah asked Adam alayhi salam to separate his people from hellfire. He asked how many, and Allah replied 999 from 1,000. Does it mean that only one person will go to Jannah and all
I think
other?
we need to check the authenticity of this narrative. I'm pretty sure this narrative is not authentically reported from the Prophet.
Thank you. There's another question, which is it permissible to use perfumes having alcohol?
Yes, absolutely. Because you see, consumption of alcohol is something that is prohibited. You can use alcohol in perfumes or any other thing that you might wear. And an example of this was found in the times of the Prophet as well. So you know that we cannot eat dead animal. That is prohibited. So the Prophet once passed by a dead animal, and he asks that why is this dead animal lying here and why is it not being consumed? So people said, well, it's a dead animal and how can we consume it? And the Prophet actually remarked that, well, you could have made shoes out of it, you could have used its hide and skin to manufacture certain things. Its eating is prohibited, but you can make other use of that animal. So by analogy, we can clearly see that things that are prohibited for oral consumption, that it has to be understood that the prohibition is confined to that oral consumption. Other
Thank
uses
you,
of that
Dr.
thing is they are absolutely fine.
Thank you for the clarification. Rafia Khwaja, you may ask your question now.
Dr. Shehzad, one often hears people saying, I don't know, quoting hadith that in Jannat men will have hoore and beautiful women with big, big eyes. And sometimes I've often wondered and thought, okay, so what happens to the women when they also get handsome men in heaven? So where does this come from? Because I don't think God is going to distinguish that only give men, some good men, rewards and the women will not be rewarded. Isn't this incorrect, hadith?
It's correct. No, it's found in the Quran actually. The Quran has said that for both there would be there would be individuals who would be pleasing to them. So the Quranic words are وَلَهُمْ فِيهَا أَزْوَاجٌ مُطَهَّرَةٌ. They would have pure and noble spouses for one another. And at another instance it is said الطَّيِّبَاتُ لِلطَّيِّبِينَ, that in paradise pure men would be with pure women. So both are mentioned. The only thing is that women at times when they are mentioned as a reward for men in paradise, they are slightly more descriptive. The Quran is more descriptive. I think this is more related to modesty in its account, because this is how a modest expression would be, that you may describe women, but when you describe men as a reward given to women, so you describe them in a little conservative way, but that does not mean that they will not be there for them.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Farhan, you may ask your question now.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Sir, my question is about the tahajjud prayer, because in the hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that Allah descends on the last 1/3 of the night to ask who is who is there to ask me for forgiveness so I can forgive him, and who is there to ask me for something so I can give it to him. Does this mean that if we make dua during the tahajjud prayer, during the tahajjud time, it will be 100% accepted and given to us?
No, it does not mean that. It only means that it has a very high probability. So when these words are reported from the Almighty, they are not as a guarantee. So you see, you have to understand that these words are reported from various narrators, and the exact words of the Prophet are generally not reported. But if you keep in mind that, God Almighty is going to reward you and punish you on the basis of your deeds. So if your deeds are such that mere forgiveness is not sufficient, then of course you would be told to atone for those as well. However, what this statement or this hadith means is that this is a time in which whatever can be forgiven or whatever is forgiven is something that will be forgiven if a person gets up at night and asks for him. But it is not 100% guarantee.
Thank you very much.
Mansoor Ahmed, you may ask your question now.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
सर सूरह अल अनाम और एक बाकी जगह पे हजरत यानी आजर के बारे में जिक्र हुआ है कि वो अबी थे हजरत इब्राहिम के, तो उसका सही तर्जुमा क्या है? क्या वो चचा थे या वालिद थे? उसमें जो तज़ाद पाया जाता है आपको बताएं।
इसका अभी कुरान के जो अल्फाज हैं उससे तो बिल्कुल वाज़ेह है कि वो वालिद थे उनके।
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Shehzad. This is just this lady who just asked a question. This is just following up on that. In Surah Waqia, it's mentioned that biwiyan for men. So I was just wondering, is it just biwiyan used for spouses, or is it specifically about men?
So you see, you need to look up the context, exact verse, but wherever women are mentioned, at times men are not mentioned, but they are automatically implied. So it's just that they are mentioned because as a reward, this is something which is very befitting to men, because of course, as the Quran has said in Surah Rahman, that there can be nothing better than a woman who is not only outwardly beautiful but also inwardly beautiful. So the words are fihinna khairatun hisan. So khairatun hisan, these are two adjectives referring to the fact that a woman who has inner and outer beauty combined, there is no greater, a greater reward for men. So wherever such virtues are mentioned, as I just said earlier on, at times men are not described in similar terms or in a similar vein, out of more out of modesty and more out of the style, a conservative style of the Quran. Otherwise, if you look at some of the other instances, you'll find that they are implied. I mean, all these attributes which women possess. I mean, you can think of parallel attributes for men, and you can just take them to be granted. Yet that yes, they would be for men as well. I mean, women would have such men as well who would be handsome, who would be whatever attributes that come to your mind about them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I have a follow-up question on this, that can we have the spouses we have in this world in Jannah, and even let's say sometimes there's one of the spouses very good in terms of religion, and the other one is not really, but can we still have it? Or
I mean, you can still have each other if provided that both of you consent. I mean, the husband and the wife have to show consent that they'll live like this in the hereafter as well. So yes, this is a possibility, but then it cannot be the will of a single spouse. I mean, both should have the same intent.
Thank you. So we will be concluding our session here. Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. Thank you all of the people for joining us and participating. See you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of the day. Allah Hafiz.